Podcast Essentials. Hello and welcome to Podcast Essentials. Why podcast? Following on from last Tuesday's The Medium is the Message, I thought we'd go a little bit deeper into why people actually bother to podcast. And it's a very personal thing. In the classes I've run, I've discovered that there's probably as many reasons as there are people, possibly even more. For anything from I've got something to say to I'm going to retire in 2 weeks after I start the podcast. So we'll unpack that a little bit as we go through. There are basically 5 or 6 main reasons I've come across with people who would like to podcast, why they're doing it. Okay, the first one, of course, is that they've got something to say. This is the reason a lot of people write, a lot of people go on YouTube, a lot of people share their photos and whatnot on Instagram and so on. So having something to say is a really important starting point. The idea of podcasting might be appealing, but unless you've got content to fill the blank space, you're basically wasting yours and your listeners' time. And while we might wonder about why we podcast, in the end, it's always for our listeners. Now, that can be to get our listeners to do things, to inform our listeners, to pass on information, to get stuff off our chest that we think other people might find interesting. I had one particular fellow who was starting his career in stand-up and decided that the best way to get the word out was by podcasting. It also led him to hone his scripts, see if there was any laughter involved with his monologues, and to get feedback from people. And I've been joined by a co-host, young Rich Bowden. Good afternoon, good evening where you are, Mr. B.
Hello, John. How are you? What time's it over there?
9:30.
Half past 9.
Yes.
Up early.
About 2 hours.
They're predicting snow tonight, John. Road closures, everything. My word.
Oh, it's almost like winter has arrived.
It has. How about over there?
Rather pleasant. We had a storm through the other night, which ripped a lot of trees about, but not much rain. And it's a balmy 17 degrees today.
Wow. Seems unusual us talking like this, isn't it? You should be talking about snow and me talking about scorcher.
Yeah, well, this weather we've received isn't what was in the brochure, but we're adapting. We're dealing with it. I've just been mentioning the fact that there are more reasons perhaps than there are people podcasting as to why people podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my students was an up-and-coming stand-up comedian who was using podcasting to test his scripts and to hone his work, which was a legitimate use of the space, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yourself, Rich, when you started, why did you get into podcasting?
Well, I had you nagging me, John, but I think there are a lot of people that say, I want to podcast without having an idea of what it is that they want to podcast about. But I could see the energy that you put into Word Organic News over the year and a half that I think before I started a real food chain. And I could see that it was a way of getting a message across on a subject that would interest both of us. I just closed down the Real Food Chain today to concentrate on other podcasts. But looking back, it's fantastic. It's served as a huge learning curve, and I'm very grateful for doing that. I feel relief in a way that I've come to the end of that, and now I'm moving on to another challenge. But to answer your question, John, going back, I did want to get into podcasting. And then the sort of, and it was a general idea, what was it going to be? Was it going to be on permaculture? Was it going to be on food, that sort of thing? And I sort of coalesced around Whole Foods and ordinary people. I was in a cafe and I could see that the prices of Whole Foods were exorbitant. They couldn't be afforded by, ordinary people. And I think study after study does show that the lower socioeconomic levels do actually suffer from a lot more diet-related diseases, and it was partially out of that. I wanted to sort of help people that way. So yeah, that was my start, John. as you recall.
Yeah, so you had a passion.
Yeah, it's definitely always there.
So this is a new passion with the new podcast?
It's a different topic, but the same passion. Still want to talk to people and try and explain to people a topic that is sometimes incomprehensible to me. I always measure it by what I think, and there's a lot of things on climate change. And Climactic is the new podcast that is a little above my head, but I know is very relevant to my living, and I wanted to do the same thing, but telling people stories with a co-host, Mark Spencer, telling people stories that do action on climate change or organic food, sustainability, that sort of thing, to make our place a better place to live.
Yeah. So it's still a passion, and I think that having a passion is the key to podcasting. As we were talking with the last episode on the medium is the message. It's the intimacy and the passion combined allows people to connect with us one-on-one. I find with the podcasts I listen to, it's almost like the people I'm listening to I know personally, even though I don't, mostly, because of that voice in the ear. It's a really, really important part of the medium, I think. So I'll just wander on a bit on some other ideas I've come across with people when they were starting the podcasts. So there was, like I was saying, there was a fella who wanted to test his scripts out for his stand-up comedy routines. There was also an older fellow who's an established child author who was then going to use his podcast to read out segments of his new books to test ideas with people and to sort of build publicity beforehand. And it by doing that, he was able to basically create an audio book by the time he finished writing it because he had it in chapters and it had already been recorded. And while people might listen to one or two episodes here or there, using the same content to create another item means that you're spreading your word further. And it's not just on podcasting, end of story. It's part of a whole mix of things, I think. There are people that does podcast, obviously, but mostly we've all got Facebook pages and blogs and all the rest of it that are all part of a mix. I think podcasting is part of a media mix is a really good idea, particularly as it builds authority and you get that intimacy and portability. People can listen to podcasts anywhere. I know I do. Driving, walking, when I used to be at work, perhaps shouldn't have been listening to them, but I used to anyway, because I could hide the headphone under the beard. Excuse me. And nobody knew I was off in the history of the Middle Ages or wherever while I was still at work. It allows you to be in more places than one. It also teaches multitasking, apparently, according to some friends of mine. Getting in touch with my feminine by multitasking. But anyway, apart from the fellow doing the book, there's also people that explore their hobbies. Now, the thing with podcasting is it's a very niche medium. And the more niche you get, the more people you get, seems to be the rule of thumb. So there's a fella who does a podcast just on microphones. And by coincidence, his name's Mike. So it's Mike on mics, which can be a bit confusing, but just microphones. And that's his passion because he's an audiophile. And if you need to wander off into the weeds with microphones, he's your man. And there are people that are interested in it. It's not for everyone. And I think that's the point with podcasting. Each podcast is for a particular slice of the population. And while radio stations are now repackaging their morning FM radio shows from 3 hours down to a 1 hour podcast, sort of misses the point of the medium. And it's just like listening to the same drivel on radio, which is why we come to podcasting anyway. The other thing I find with podcasting and why people go into it, and it's a really good reason to do it, is to build brand awareness, which is what both the comedian and the book author were doing. It allows people, if you give them, what's the word I'm after, give them value. You're not just selling, but letting them know what the brand what your brand does by interviewing people that are in the same field, letting them know what the what's the word I'm after, changes coming in the field, developments, the way things move.
So
That
value
actually,
added, John.
that's the word I'm after. Thank you. And providing value for people.
Mm.
You know, it's you know, I could just be pushing the course, but I'm not. I think talking to people one-on-one, this is a lot easier. And it teaches people more about what's going on in the medium and gives them a feel for it. So, like I was saying before about content being used in more than one place, I'm doing this on YouTube, so it'll be on my YouTube channel, but I'll also rip the audio out, put it in a podcast feed. And I've also written a blog post to support it, which will come out tomorrow, because not everyone listens this way or learns audio, what's the word I'm after? Audiologically, if that's a word. And same with the YouTube thing. Not everyone's got time to sit down and watch. And some people, I've got a friend who's deaf. She subscribes, but then reads the show notes that come because they're the script I use. So it's a way into whom we are for a whole range of people who find it particularly interesting in our niches. World Organic News is what it says on the tin. I cover things like decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. That's the main focus. So the narrower the niche, the more interesting the stories become, and the more engaged the audience is, I find. What's another reason? Oh yeah,
sorry, John. I was just going to ask a question. The sort of research that I did when we first started out with the Real Food Chain was that you connected with your audience best by imagining one person and then talking to them. Do you agree with that, or did you take a different slant?
Well, to start with, I was more concerned about the technical side of stuff and making sure the sound was recording. Excuse me. And the podcast was actually going out in the feed. But after about 10 or 15 episodes, I did concentrate on one person. And that person's changed a little bit over time because my focus has changed. And that happens. I mean, it's my show. I can do what I like with it. And that's what people can do with their show. There's no executive producer hanging over your shoulder saying, time's up, we need the studio for something else, get out. Or that wasn't on point this week. Well, I'm sorry, this was something that interested me. And I think my listeners, or in particular that one listener, would find this interesting. And there's a freedom. Of course, with the freedom comes the danger of being all over the shop, which can be a problem. As I was just about to say, the one other lady I spoke to who I was teaching is in the position of just moving from full-time work to part-time work to retirement. And her idea was to interview people that have been through the system about 6-7 months up to 12, sort of 5 years ahead of her. The idea of the 5 or 6 months ahead of her was that the legislation changes with regard to retirement in most countries every so often. And so the newer people would be more on top of the technical side, the administration. But the people that have been through it 4 or 5 years ahead of her would be able to talk about the emotional side, the changes, making sure you still had purpose in life and that sort of thing. And everyone's story is different, but there's a theme. And I found it a really interesting idea. She's still putting her stuff together, and because she's working full time, she hasn't quite got started yet. But the idea was really, really good. And I think if you have a killer idea, a great idea, something you can get your passion behind, then it's much easier to sustain your podcast. Perhaps the worst reason for going into podcasting is to become a millionaire. Because we both know we're rolling in cash because of it. But as a hobby, if you think of it as a hobby to start with, it's not a particularly expensive one compared to say fly fishing or parachuting or even miniature dollhouse collecting. I mean, I was horrified at the prices people pay for that stuff. But it's their passion. And I'm sure there's a podcast out there on that. But if you're going into it just for the money, you don't have the passion to drive it. And that's not to say you can't make money out of it. I mean, there was the original history podcast, as far as I can tell, is The History of Rome by Mike Duncan. I think it was about 70, 80 odd episodes in before he asked we, the listeners, would it be okay if he advertised, because someone had approached him. And with that sort of respect for the listeners, I think that's why he was able to be successful. That and the fact that his content was good. And so this was, I don't know, a few years ago now. But then he added other things and did tours of Rome for people, and ended up a couple of years after that series finished with the death of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in the West. He ended up writing a book on the lead up to the end of the Republic. So there's money to be made, but you've got to establish your authority, and you've got to spend time connecting with people, I think. If you're just going in for the money, you won't last past 7 episodes, which is the dreaded pod fade number.
I was listening to sorry, John, I was going to say I was listening to a podcast by a guy that runs, I've got the podnews.net, I just can't remember his name. He did a very, very good, interesting with the School of Dave Jackson, I think it was, School of Podcasting. He said exactly what you just said then, that, he gets people that say, oh, yeah, I want to get in. How can I make money out of this? And he says, they're sorely disappointed. You got to look at it as a hobby. Or I was talking to a lady today that runs a permaculture cafe. I suggested a podcast. She had all these ideas that she was throwing at me. Fascinating lady. And I said, as a podcast, and first she said, well, how do I make money out of that? And then she stopped mid-sentence and said, well, okay, now I can see how that can contribute towards the cafe, just building up the knowledge and the interest. And so we left it at that, but it'd be a very interesting podcast to do, I think, interviews with people that come onto the permaculture farm, people that come from all over the world to work there, people that come into the cafe. And it's not a money-making venture in itself, but it does help increase the business, or at least that was the idea.
Yeah, so it's about supporting a business. I think people like NGOs are missing a trick by not having a podcast, explaining what they do, how they make a difference to the world. And it's not an overly expensive thing to do, especially for a large, small to medium enterprise like which a lot of NGOs are in effect, even though their funding may be from elsewhere. But you can get the message out about what you're doing, and if you go into it with a long-term view rather than, we have to get 10,000 listeners in a week. And there are people that do that. If you've got, say, that many people following your blog, it's not that hard to get them to come across at least once. But as a long-term underpinning of what it is you do, and with an NGO, say disability NGO, they could, with the right permissions and the right people, of course, engage with the clients on it so that they can hear their own voices back at them. The unheard part of the population can actually hear themselves in their own ears or with their friends. I don't think we've fully explored the potential of the medium yet, and we're only 14 years into it, so it's not surprising when you compare television 14 years into what it is now. We might have to go through our I Love Lucy stage to get to the really interesting stuff. Terrifying as that thought is.
And it's all about, just getting back to your point on NGOs, John, it's interesting what you say. I think a lot of the problem is that they need to ask for money. Obviously, that's what they do. But by providing extra content, a bit of, interesting story behind it, a human story, and then just giving a little nudge towards the listeners, if you'd like, please contact. I think that way people these days, they don't like being told, look, we need money, put it in here. But a podcast would suit that situation really well.
Yeah, I think people are getting switched off to the pictures of starving children, which is...
Unfortunately, yes, you're right.
But if you can actually hear the stories from the people, and the people on the front line, and maybe a chat with the CEO once a month, this is where I'm heading, this is where we're taking the organisation. What do you think? it's a way for them to test ideas and to drive their mission, basically, with an underpinning of intimacy and authority. It's a strong, it's a very powerful combination, podcasting, and I think people are missing a trick by not jumping on the bandwagon, as they say. But again, you've got to have the right intent and the passion. And if you're looking for passion, you've just got to find people in NGOs. That's why they work there. The pay is lower, but the rewards are higher quite often.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the match would be ideal, but that's just me. So we'll see how that goes. And so you're into this your new passion project, Mr. B. It's coming along. You've got past the dreaded episode 7 yet?
We have episode 10, so I think we're going quite well. Look, I love it. Working with Mark Spencer is fantastic. He's a lot younger than me, a lot more energy than me, and he's the yes we can man, and I'm the no we bloody well can't. Am I allowed to say that on video?
We'll deal with that in post production. Note the future me. Edit that
out. No, it's great. Look, we're trying to tell people stories. You were just talking about that with NGOs. We're trying to tell people stories, people that are there, that work in climate change, sustainability, and ask them to tell us their story. We also do a monthly special, which is a little bit more scripted and a little bit more adventurous. We're still feeling our way on that one, but we actually tell the story. The latest one was the whole waste recycling problem here in Australia. It's actually around the world, but the fact that China has now stopped receiving waste, they've got new guidelines now. They stop receiving waste from the world, and we have to deal with it, and it's the same everywhere. So we can look at it as either a crisis of what to do with all this waste, or we can look at it as an opportunity, and that's what we've taken as the narrative. And we're halfway through a 2-part special on that.
Yeah. I'm always reminded of Bill Mollison, co-founder of permaculture, who said waste is just a resource in the wrong place. Which I think makes a hell of a difference when you're facing it. But, well, if anything, you go.
I was just going to say, coming across some great research as part of it, the whole circular economy thing, which I must admit I was a little bit hazy on. But you'd know a lot about this, John, with Regenerate the Soil over in World Organic News. It's something you've been talking about for a long time. But we need to put more back into the soil rather than take out of it, and this whole circular economy is based on that, and we've come across that through waste. But you would know, John, through organic farming, that's exactly what farmers need to do to preserve the soil that they use.
Well, basically, the industrial agricultural system is a pipeline from the soil to the ocean via the sewer. But and the circular economy we've covered on World Organic News and the blog anyway. Haven't done much on the podcast yet, but so that's the point I think I've been making. If people listen to the passion in your voice there, Rich, they can tell this is what comes across with a podcast. And people, you can tell when a podcast producer is authentic or not, or whether they're not, or whether they're just saying the things they've been told to say, because that's what you need to do to make money. It's so obvious. There's nowhere to hide in this medium, and that's one of its great strengths, and why I enjoy it. So
I was just going to say, and also it suits different styles. I mean, I'm the sort of person that hates being shouted at by breakfast presenters and the podcasts that feature them. I just switch off straight away. 5 minutes is more than enough for me. So 5 seconds. But other people love it. They love that sort of energy and in your face sort of stuff. So yeah, we all have our different choices, and I think podcasting, there's so much out there now that we can pick and choose as we like.
And that's true, but compared to the number of blogs in the world, there's hardly any podcasts. So I think there's plenty of room left. So if people are interested in having a look at what it is to podcast, they can come over to mrjohnmoore.com. I'll put the link in the show notes when I do the podcast. It's also in the notes for this this YouTube video if you want to have a look there. I've got some checklists that people might want to click on to get themselves orientated to the medium. And if you're ready to jump in, then there's a podcast essentials course on the website as well.
Well, this is what you were running through the classes, was that right, John?
Yeah, it's the face-to-face course that I've now put online. So you can, and everything's available at once. There's no drip feeding. You can go through it at whatever speed you want.
Okay.
And if people need coaching and assessing, or they'd like me to do the legwork in the background after they've recorded their audio, I'm happy to do that too. So I think the more people we can get out there podcasting, the better. And I think particularly NGOs, it's a no-brainer. It gives them a bit more. It gives them the authority and the reach that they're looking for, particularly the smaller ones. And next Tuesday, it's a bit more on a technical level rather than philosophical. I'll be covering the mechanics of podcasting. How to get your audio file from your laptop or your smartphone, if you're doing it that way, into the ears of your listeners, and the way it travels, and who has and doesn't have a copy of your audio file, and how they access it. So that'll be fun. That'll be at the same time on Tuesday morning, which I think 19th, I believe. Maybe the 18th, I can't recall. But it's next Tuesday anyway. So if you've got nothing else to add, Mr. B, I'll wrap this up.
The only thing to add is that your lessons are highly recommended. I was your first student. I'm still very proud to say that. And anyone watching, I recommend you head over to mrjohnmoore.com.
Thank you, Rich. Much appreciated.
No, that's all right.
Well, on that happy note, we'll wrap this up, and I'll see you all on Tuesday.
See you, John. Thank you again.
No worries. Bye.